Okay, so we are going to now look at some of the more long-term and immediate causes of the French Revolution. And if we don't have time for it in this video, we'll also look at the early phase of the French Revolution when the National Assembly meets. So first off, one of the more long-term causes is that old order, the ancien regime, which we were looking at here, so the three estates, are going to start to break down in the 18th century. And a lot of this is because the three estates aren't really realistic in the 18th century. In particular, we're going to see that the third estate is going to become increasingly diverse. And especially the bourgeoisie, they feel as though economically they are not far off from the nobility, but yet they don't have any political representation. And so they're going to increasingly resent the old order, and they're also going to be resentful of the king and the nobility. Um, but even before we get into that, realize that just a few years prior to the French Revolution, the American Revolution had taken place. And if you are familiar with US history at this time, remember that the French have a major role in the American Revolution, right? Many historians argue that if it wasn't for the involvement of the French, the Americans would not have won, right? So um, the French get involved mainly because they are enemies of the British. So anything to, defeat the British is obviously good for the French. So they get involved um, militarily with the United States in the French Revolution. And when they are there, they also are really inspired by the way that the colonists are kind of using the Enlightenment ideals to form a brand new government, right? So it's kind of a combination of these first two bullet points, all right? They find that the American Revolution is very inspirational because they actually take the Enlightenment ideals and do something with them, okay? Um, it's in particular it's the French bourgeoisie and the lower nobility. They're really intrigued by the American ideals of liberty. But here's the problem with the French involvement in the American Revolution. Obviously, when you send a military somewhere, you have to spend money. So um, the aid to the Americans results in an increase in the French debt, which was already huge. Remember, the wars of Louis XIV were very expensive. And then you also have the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, which was very expensive. Okay, so um, getting involved in these may have kind of inspired them, but at the same time, they were very, very pricey, and someone is going to have to foot that bill. So we're going to see how that happens in the next slide here. Also realize um, that the French are increasingly attracted to laissez-faire economics. Another Enlightenment thinker was Adam Smith, who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And remember that the French mercantilist system was not like the British. They weren't promoting individual wealth. They were only using mercantilism to help strengthen the wealth of the state itself. Okay, so the middle class is really kind of resenting the French government because they feel that the government is interfering with their economic activities. So they think that they should have more ability to get wealthy individually, and they don't want the French government to be so involved um, in their systems of trade. Also, you're going to see that more and more people in the third estate, mostly the bourgeoisie, are going to increasingly criticize the government for being inefficient, for being corrupt, and also for continuously giving the aristocracy all these privileges like tax exemptions. Okay. They also think that laws should be more uniform. So basically, that everyone should be subject to the same laws. They don't like the idea of divine right. Um, and there's really no representative assembly that exists in France. So really what we're thinking about with the breakdown of the old order is that by the 18th century, the three estates are no longer realistic. Okay, they don't really reflect the wealth of France and the ability in French society. So remember that there are members of the third estate, like we mentioned earlier, the bourgeoisie. They're accumulating a lot of wealth, but yet no political power. And so actually, there are two theories about how this led to the French Revolution. There's a more traditional view historically, which is a little bit more simple. Okay, and that is that the bourgeoisie is going to unite, right? And it's because they have the same economic position, they have the same class interest, and they're very frustrated by feudal laws and the fact that they are not exempt from taxes while the first and second estate are. Okay, so under this traditional theory, the the uh, the bourgeoisie kind of rise up and they lead the third estate, and this we'll see in a little while is going to result in the abolition of feudal privileges, and it's going to establish a more capitalist society that's based on individualism and a market economy. So in other words, this traditional theory is saying that the French Revolution is one of its major causes is tension between the second and the third estate. Then there's this more recent research, okay, and this makes things a little bit more complicated, okay, because some historians question how much of a social conflict there really was between the bourgeoisie and the nobility. Okay, the bourgeoisie and the nobility themselves, they're not monolithic classes, which means they're not like all exactly alike, even within their classes. Okay, there are internal rivalries within the bourgeoisie and the nobility. Okay, also remember that just because you are a member of the bourgeoisie does not mean if you accumulate enough wealth that you can't change your social status. Remember that there were members of the bourgeoisie that could accumulate enough wealth to purchase a noble title. Remember the nobility of the robe? And so, because of this, these more recent researchers are saying that a lot of nobles and the middle class actually share liberal ideals. And both of them are sort of opposed, or actually, both of them kind of support the Parlement of Paris, which is kind of serving as like this judicial opposition to the government. Okay, so basically, this theory is saying that it's both the nobility and the bourgeoisie that are becoming frustrated with the monarch's continuous attempts to assert absolute power. So some people kind of still support this more traditional view. They think that the bourgeoisie is kind of acting on its own um, to kind of build up resistance to the monarchy, and then there are other historians that say that the nobility was very much involved as well. Okay, another cause, it's a more immediate cause of the French Revolution, is financial mismanagement. We were just talking about how there are several wars leading up to the French Revolution, which were incredibly expensive. So, what is happening is that by the 1780s, half of the French annual budget went to the payment of interest on the mounting debt. Okay, let's pause for a second. Interest, not the actual amount of money that they owe, but just the interest. Okay, so imagine if you owed a ton of money on your credit card, right? Every month, you don't only have to pay off, or at least you're not only supposed to be paying off your principal, which is the amount of money that you owe, but you also get interest racked onto that because you were borrowing money, you have to pay it back with interest. Can you imagine if the only thing that the French government was able to do was pay the interest? They're not even paying the debt, okay? And we already talked about these causes, but again, just to reiterate, there were colonial wars with England, like the French and Indian War, very expensive. French participation in the American Revolution was also quite expensive. Now, the interesting thing, though, with this debt is that there were other countries that actually were in more debt than France. Britain was in about 5 times as much debt per capita, and the Dutch Republic also had less debt than than the French. So you might ask the question, which is obviously a very fair question, how come the French can't pay off their debt, but England and the Dutch Republic can? It all has to do with the way in which the debt is managed. Okay, in France, by this time, they can no longer declare bankruptcy. Why? Because the people that the French were borrowing money from, they are the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie. Okay, and if you declare bankruptcy, that means you're not going to repay your debt. And the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie are not going to let that happen. They are going to demand that the French government pay them back. Okay, so therefore the French are unable to declare bankruptcy. Another huge problem is that the French government, because of the old order or the ancien regime, they're only able to um, pay, or they're only able to get revenue a uh, from the third estate through taxes, right? So this means that even though the first and second estate are only a small percentage of the population, they have a lot of money and they have a lot of land, and none of this can be taxed. Another reason why the French are struggling significantly with their debt is because they don't have a bank, they don't have paper currency, and they have no other means of creating credit. Okay, so this means that the only way that the government can get revenue is to raise taxes, and we already know how the first and second estate feel about that. So basically what this means is that the government is dependent on only the poorest classes in society to get revenue. All right. Um, you're also going to see that I already kind of mentioned this, but the mercantilist policies of the French government are going to be criticized by businessmen and merchants. All right. They want a more laissez-faire system. Okay, so this is going to be another reason why the revolution breaks out, because, ultimately the state is trying to control the economy, and these wealthy merchants don't want this to happen. Okay, there's also massive inflation. All right, between the 1730s and the 1780s, you're going to see that the price of consumer goods increases about 65%, but wages only rise 22%. Okay, this is actually going to mean that some of the poor members of the third estate are going to have to spend up to half of their income just on food. Okay, just to kind of introduce a comparison, I think these days the average American spends about maybe 10% of their income on food. So imagine if it was 50%. That's more money than people spend on rent or a mortgage these days. Okay, so this is just unsustainable for the poorest classes. All right, so remember that the French government wants to raise taxes to solve this problem, but the privileged classes are going to continuously refuse to do this. So what happens? Well, to try to address this problem, Louis the XVI hires a director of finances, a man named Jacques Necker, and he is again going to try to raise taxes. But the Parlement, remember, the Parlement has the ability to approve of or refuse the king's decrees. Okay, so the king is going to try to decree an increase in taxes in the first and second estate. The Parliament's going to say no, and then Jacques Necker is going to be dismissed. Okay, so Louis the 16th decides that his way to maybe get around the Parlement is to summon a group of clergy and nobility, and they're called the Assembly of Notables. Okay, and his hope is that he can again issue this decree to raise taxes, and he can convince the Assembly of Notables to approve of this new tax program, which again would mean that the first and second estate would be taxed. All right. Um, the Assembly of Notables is going to say, look, if you want to raise taxes for us, we need to have the ability actually to have a more representative form of government. And what is that? Well, it's this group called the Estates General. Okay, the Estates General was a representative body that literally had not met since 1614. Okay, so it gives you a sense of how much the monarchs were ruling as absolute monarchs if the Estates General had been out of session for such a long time. Okay, so the Assembly of Notables is again saying, look, we're not going to approve of this tax increase unless you let the Estates General meet. They the king decides, all right, I'm going to try to dismiss these nobles because I don't want the third estate to meet. That would totally challenge my absolute authority. So he dismisses the nobles and establishes taxes by decree. All right. Now I'm going to stop here because we're getting close to the 15-minute mark. I'll pick up with the same slide in just a second.